Good evening and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And if you've watched this show for a while, you know that we occasionally like to step outside of the local boundaries of our show and talk about international things, take a more global view. So we're very fortunate tonight in that our guest is the Consul General from the country of France here in Chicago, or France, should I say? Guillaume Lacroix. So, Mr. Lacroix, it's such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Okay.
Well, the first thing I want to ask, which will seem very basic, is what is a consulate and what does it do and how is it different from an embassy? So what is it?
A consul, or consul general, runs a consulate. A consulate is an office that represents foreign country in a country, but not in a capital city. That is the difference between a consulate and an embassy. I am the representative of the French government in Chicago for the Midwest region. I am not the representative of the French government to the federal government of the United States. That is the ambassador who is based in Washington. I work under his authority in the Midwest region, and I have relations not with the federal government, but with the local government, the civil society, the French community, the universities, all the groups of people who are not federal. The core job of a consul is to look after, for a French consul, after the French community.
And actually I understand from speaking with you earlier, the French community in Chicago is probably larger than most people understand. How large is the community here?
In Chicago, the community is roughly 9,000 people. That is for Chicago and the state of Illinois. But I have responsibility for 13 states in the Midwest region, which means that my community, the French community in the Midwest, is composed of 25,000 people. It's probably more than you would have expected.
That's definitely more than I would have expected. And so as Consul General then, when you're talking with government leaders or industry, is it part of your job then to try to develop business interests, for example, like business connections between the French community here or between the country and local government or local businesses and industries here in Chicago? Is that part of what the Consul General does?
More and more. This is really important. Say the core business of a consul is to look after its community, but the French community here in the Midwest has no problem. It's very well integrated, has no issues, and they do contribute to the prosperity of the United States. So I have more time to devote to what is becoming increasingly important for the French diplomat overseas, is to promote business connections, promote French exports to the United States for big companies, for less big companies, for small companies. And normally the smaller companies need more support from the French government than the big ones who can do their business without ourselves, and we don't want to interfere, and we don't want to be a problem. We want to facilitate, but also to promote France as a business destination, and that is a top priority for our government. Our President Macron, is very keen on spreading the message that France is open for business.
Well, in fact, that was part of what his campaign was. He's been in office a year now, and so it was a business-friendly environment, which governments go back and forth. Some are more friendly than others. But as I recall, this was part of his campaign message as well, to open up for business, right?
Absolutely. He has a policy that is consistent with his electoral platform. France should be a country that should be more attractive for business. Business coming from the French investments, but we also need, in this globalized world, more and more investment from foreign countries. And the United States is nowadays the #1 investor in France, above Germany. And that is a signal, I think, that there is a growing trend for American business to look at France differently.
Well, that's interesting. What do you think accounts for that change? What has generated that new interest in France from the American business community as opposed to Germans who are right next door?
Probably a recognition that France is a market that is promising and that American investors have confidence in our future, which is good in this period that is quite troubled, including in Europe. But also an assessment that investing in France is an opportunity for them to earn money, and to earn money through a country that is a kind of hub to continental Europe, because France is not alone. France is part of an integrated market, which is the European market.
Right.
And probably the third reason, but that is my reading, a sense that innovation in France is getting bigger and bigger. So investing in France now is a big promise for the future, because the network of startups, of innovation base that is there is very vibrant and will deliver fruits in the larger economy.
Now, the contrary trend, as I'm sure you're aware of, is this sense that we, and especially the United States, may be embarking on a series of trade wars with our trading partners for reasons certainly that I don't particularly grasp, but that seem apparent to others. Do you see that as a countervailing force, or is the government of France worried about some of these more restrictive trade policies, what we here think of as protectionism, trying to put up trade barriers instead of encouraging free trade? Are these issues that your government is struggling with?
President Macron is pretty clear about this issue. We believe in free trade. We believe in fair trade. We believe in
now, define fair trade. That means a lot of different things to different people. So what's your view of fair trade?
It is a trade that is conducted according to the World Trade Organization's rules, not because there are rules that are from outside, but these are the rules that we have given ourselves through a negotiated process. And the largest countries in the World Trade Organizations are the Western countries, including France, including European countries, and including the United States. And while we believe in free and fair trade, we don't think that's a good idea to start a commercial war, especially among allies.
Well, I personally, I'm one of the people who would agree with that point of view, but you know, as you know, there are different points of view here in the United States. I think it's interesting, you mentioned the World Trade Organization and that these rules come from the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And there is a sense, I feel, in America, that the WTO is one of those global bodies that's out there somewhere trying to tell us what to do. In fact, the United States was one of the founders of the World Trade Organization, and it was our desire, our hope, to be able to create this framework of rules and laws that everyone could abide by in order to facilitate this kind of trade. Do you find it ironic that now in the U.S. this is seen as a suspect organization instead of something that we helped create?
Sometimes world bodies or international bodies are too technocratic. We in France, we have a public opinion that can become very critical of the European Union because it is seen as a bureaucratic, technocratic organization. But the truth is these bodies, these fora for international cooperation, are institutions based on the rule of law and based on rules and regulation. And the point is, what do we prefer? A world with regulations, maybe imperfect, but with an order, with regulation, or a world without an order, which in other words is called a disorder.
Or chaotic, as you might. And actually, that's an interesting, not to get too far down the rabbit hole on this, but you know, I speak with economists and with other people who watch trade and think about these things, and there is this sense that these regulations inhibit free market capitalism, and that the ultimate ideal of a free market would be no regulations, you know, because regulations inhibit whatever. They inhibit growth, they inhibit expansion, they inhibit wanting to do what you need to do. But in fact, it doesn't seem that the opposite is true. The growth of world trade has centered around this construction of this set of rules. Is that your perspective as well, or is that?
Yes, regulation. I hear people complaining about regulations, and maybe even in France there are too many regulations. And Mr. Macron is trying to transform the economy to make it more flexible and more conducive for conducting business, in particular for the people who are taking risks. But at the same time, there are a number of issues where regulation is needed. Look at the internet and digital giants.
Mm-hmm.
Look at the problems that everyone is faced with in its daily life. There is obviously a need for more regulation. Look at food security. It's an important issue in Europe, in North America as well. We need safety, we need security, we need to know what we eat in our plate. And without regulations, we would be exposed to many risks.
In fact, we saw some of that in China a few years ago. There was tainted milk. It was some sort of plastic was being introduced into the milk because it was white and it made it, it could expand the volume. And it turned out people died. And that was kind of a shock to China, the Chinese economy, which hadn't really internalized this idea of food safety regulations the way I think the Western countries have. And we saw the consequences of that lack there. So I would agree that this is the kind of way to create an environment where people don't feel threatened by business. They feel that business is their partner.
Absolutely.
So the other, one of the other major events, as you know, is the British withdrawal from the European Union, commonly known as Brexit. How is the government of France reacting to that? What effect do you think it will have on the French economy and the European Union as a whole?
I think the French government and the French political class and the French people in general have regretted the decision by the British people. But this was a democratic decision, a sovereign decision. So why we do regret it, we respect it. The way I see it, and this is more a personal comment, it is not a divorce. It is UK pulling out of the European Union. And there is no doubt about it. Now there is a process, a negotiating process engaged, and that will end up with UK withdrawing from EU. But it doesn't mean that UK will become a stranger to us. UK remains a strong partner of France in many fields, including security, counter-terrorism, and value sharing. We share so many values with UK. So they remain
societal values kind of thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. They remain part of the family. They remain part of the European family. It's not a divorce, it's a separation.
Well, I like that description and the idea that the European family has become integrated enough to feel like a family, even though, of course, we know the history of warfare in Europe for the last several millennia. But it seemed that post-World War II that Europe had entered really a new phase of cooperation that seemed to be inevitably more intertwined. And I think that's part of the shock of Brexit, that all of a sudden that intertwining didn't seem quite so inevitable, that there could be hiccups along the way. Do you think this is a signal of any kind of larger trend, or do you think this is kind of a one-off situation?
I believe, Kevin, that the situation you describe is the major challenge of our generation. Because our grandparents, our parents have built a united Europe, a Europe that is at peace, a peace that had never existed before. By the way, thank you, America, for what you did in 1944 and 1945. And you have always supported the creation of the European Union alongside our countries. This is a legacy that we need to protect. Maybe the younger generation is less aware of the price that our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents paid for a peaceful Europe, for a Europe that is based on shared values, based on the rule of law, and based on the rejection of nationalism, which was the big evil of Europe in the 19th century and in the first half of the 20th century.
So nationalism, and you use that word, and I know that's in the discussion of American politics now as well, this idea of nationalism and it being resurgent. And as I read it, the way that's positioned is that, well, this globalization, which is used as an insult by some people and as a compliment in others, has resulted in a lot of people being left out, the have-nots, and that the nationalism is a way for the have-nots to kind of raise their hand and say, wait, I'm not benefiting from this. Do you think that that's part of what's going on? And if so, how can that be reconciled with the unity that we've spent 70 years building?
Nationalism and what we call in France patriotism is a different thing. You may love your country, and it is a duty to love your country, to love its values, to love what it stands for, but that does not make you a nationalist. A nationalist is someone who believes that everything that comes from his or her country is superior to others, and it has the consequence that people may have collectively an aggressive behavior, and that is a problem, and that was the problem of Europe that we are trying to get rid for good. But what you're describing is something that is happening in Europe, in France in particular. The growing concern of the middle class in Europe or in Western countries. People were raised with the idea that the generation to come, the next generation, would have a better life, better standards of living, better revenues, better opportunities. And to some extent, sometimes to a large extent in some regions, this is no longer the case. And it is normal, it is legitimate that people ask questions. Why is that so? What is the reason? And the obvious or the easiest, some people may say the cheap answer is to blame globalization, to blame free trade, to blame others. We don't believe that is the answer. It needs courage, and this is what Mr. Macron achieved in his campaign, to tell people not only that he will do whatever it takes to protect them, but also to build a future and to believe in the future. The worst thing is to become pessimistic. The worst thing is to believe that future will only bring problems. That is a sign of a society that is no longer growing. Societies that is not capable of competing with others. We need to be able to compete with others according to fair rules, according to fair games, and believe in the future. And this is I think, the key message or the key elements that we can draw from Mr. Macron's victory. He won against a person.
Against all odds as well.
Against all odds, and including against some people who you may call populist, who believe that the only solution for France in the 21st century is to close the borders, to close the doors, and to put their hands in the sand.
And in fact, it was a pretty convincing victory as well. I remember reading that the polls leading up were kind of uncertain, and it was possible that the populist opponent might actually get a fair part of the vote, but it turns out in the end it wasn't all that close, that Mr. Macron was actually quite successful. Right?
Very successful. It came as a surprise. He was elected a year ago, as you said in your introduction, but a year and a half ago, many people predicted that Mr. Macron would be a serious contender for the next election in 2022.
Yeah.
And here he is, elected, and I'm not a political expert, I'm not a political pundit, I'm a representative of the French government. Yes. But I think it is fair to admit that a large majority of French people, after 1 year of Mr. Macron being the president, still say, let's give him a chance.
Even though there are quite a bit of there's unrest now, a lot of strikes happening in France at the moment. But do you see this as just sort of a normal part of the fact that he's trying to make significant changes, and change always brings some level of resistance? Or do you think there's any kind of failure for the French population, the French people, to fully buy into the agenda. And do you see any kind of danger signals here?
This is democracy. Not everyone is obliged to support the president. Thanks God.
Yes, that's true.
And we are citizens. We have mixed feelings sometimes. There are some options that we fully agree with. There are some options that we may disagree with. And that is the normal course of democracy. And the right to demonstrate, the right to oppose, the right to strike is the constitutional right in France and in the United States. It was predictable that some social problems would arise. That is normal when a government or leader wants to carry out reform that change the status quo. What is important is to see after months, after years, and that will be for the French people to see and to decide whether these changes were valuable for the French people or not. And this will be based on the economic results. And probably the main parameter will be the capacity of this government to reduce significantly mass unemployment.
It's a similar issue here, although unemployment is very low in the United States now. Underemployment is a significant problem. People who are not employed at their full capacity, they're working part-time, or much more importantly, they're working for wages that don't allow them to lead a sustainable lifestyle. And so that's, I think, the economic crisis we see here. It sounds as though there's something similar happening in probably throughout the European Union, but certainly in France as well. I want to come back to something you said earlier that strikes me, and that is the need for optimism. And it's a high hurdle to get around, because as you probably know, once people start to feel pessimistic, it's very hard to turn that around. So what do you think governments, not just your government, but governments in general, can or should do in order to try to reinfuse optimism and to counter this feeling of being a victim or being aggrieved about something?
Bring results.
Yeah, that's pretty straightforward.
Bring results, but also reinvent the sense of living together. We are going through a transition period from one kind of economy, one kind of a society to another one. The digital revolution, innovation, globalization, a more competing environment. So I'm not an historian, but I've read books, and we all know that in periods of transitions,
there's
doubt arise, unrest, concern about the future. And it is up to not only the younger generation, but every generation to come together and define a way of living together, working together, being one country or one community, and to adjust it to the reality of the day, of today and the day and tomorrow. What I mean by that is that we have a core principle, core values. We should stick to them. But if there are some changes to be made, let's do the changes for the benefit of our people. Take the example of climate change. It is a time bomb. We all know that. Science...
Not everyone knows that. There are people who dispute that to this day.
Science proves it. But I think even the ones who challenge that recognize that the environment needs to get some protection, that some efforts should be made with regard to clean energy. Investment should be made. But regardless, climate change, it is a time bomb. There would be many reasons to be pessimistic and to say in 50 years from now, where will we be? The truth is, the international community, governments, civil society, business, came together in Paris a few years back to conclude a universal accord that will...
Known as the Paris Accords. Yes.
Paris Accord, we are very proud of that, as you can hear.
Yes, yes.
That brings a solution. Maybe not the only solution possible, but at the very minimum demonstrate that mankind can come up with solutions, and with global challenges like climate change, where the survival of humanity is at stake, only a global solution can bring prosperity and avoid the collision course and the worst case scenario.
So that I take that to heart. I mean, I think that's a message to Americans as well. Well, to around the globe, but particularly to Americans, because we are still the largest economy and have tremendous weight in the world. That this idea of coming together is much more important than pointing fingers and blaming someone else. That we all face these problems, global warming certainly being a significant one, and that the solutions will only come about through this unity. In fact, there's a book I read some years ago by an economist, a fellow named Julian Simon, who wrote a book called The Ultimate Resource. And this was back in the days when people thought that overpopulation would be the ruin of the planet. Well, it turns out now we're worried about shrinking populations, just the opposite. But he wrote that population was not the problem because we would never run out of anything that mattered. And the reason was that the only resource, the name of the book, The Ultimate Resource, is human intelligence and human ingenuity. And the more brains we had working on this stuff, the more likely it would be that we would come up with a solution, even to something as intractable as what used to be referred to as peak oil. We've apparently reached this peak oil point many times over the last several decades, but that we would run out of oil and the world would collapse. But in fact, that has not happened, and alternative energy has really blossomed in the last couple of decades. So this is, I think, in keeping with what you're talking about, that this idea of coming together to find collective solutions is much more important than pointing fingers, trying to find someone to blame. Is that fair?
Yes, this is a measurement of leadership, and it's difficult for European governments because they rely so much on the public opinion's mind, and in times of transition, people's mind can change very easily, and people are exposed to challenges like the so-called fake news, like the sense of citizenship maybe that is fading a little bit, and economic hardship. So to find a way to convince people to keep together, to stay together, is difficult. Words do matter, but action are even better, and results the only really way out. It's difficult, it's challenging, but it requires courage, but also vision.
And do you think that we have, I'm not trying to put you in a political corner here, do you think the world as a whole has the kind of vision necessary? And I'm not thinking just about the United States or even the European Union, but around the world. I mean, we have competing visions of the world. China has a vision, the US has a vision, the European Union has a vision, and they don't seem to line up all that well. Do you think we can achieve this unified vision?
That is why we need world bodies and world organizations, not bureaucracies, but fora for making collective decisions and making sure that the decisions that we take collectively are being respected and implemented, rules of the games.
Well, I can't think of a better way to sum up. We're already out of time. So, Mr. Lacroix, thank you so much for spending time with us. I really appreciated talking with you, and I've certainly learned a lot by having you here.
Thanks, Kevin. It was great to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. And thank you for joining us once again for Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And you can find us on Comcast Channel 19 every Saturday night at 8, or see us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So until next time, thank you. Good night.